You don't belong on this court. You never did. Go back to wherever you came from and stop wasting everyone's time." The man who said that was wearing a blazer with the Westbrook Elite Tennis Academy logo stitched in gold above his chest pocket. His name was Raymond Holt, and he had been coaching junior tennis for 22 years. He had produced 3 ATP Top 50 players. He had shaken hands with senators. He believed, genuinely and completely, that he could recognize talent within 30 seconds of watching someone walk onto a court. He was wrong about one person in his entire career. That person was standing right in front of him, holding a racket with a cracked grip wrapped in electrical tape, wearing shoes that had been resoled twice. His name was Calvin Reyes. Calvin had driven 4 hours from Beaumont, Texas to Houston that morning. He left at 4 a.m. because his truck's air conditioning didn't work, and he wanted to make it before the summer heat turned the cab into an oven. He stopped once for gas and a coffee he couldn't really afford, then kept driving with the windows down, one hand on the wheel, the radio picking up and dropping stations as the miles passed. He was 31 years old. He worked maintenance at a middle school in Beaumont. He mopped floors. He fixed leaking pipes under bathroom sinks. He replaced fluorescent bulbs in hallways where kids ran past without looking up. He had been doing it for 6 years, and he was good at it. And nobody who saw him in that building would have guessed that between the ages of 14 and 19, Calvin Reyes had been one of the most quietly gifted tennis players anyone in South Texas had ever seen. Nobody knew because nobody had ever been looking. His father, Ernesto, had taught him on public courts in a park near their house. Ernesto had learned from a man he caddied for as a teenager, and that man had taught him not as an equal, but as a curiosity. A Mexican kid who picked things up fast enough to make the round more interesting. Ernesto never forgot that. He taught Calvin everything he knew, which was more than people realized, and he taught him the way you teach someone you actually believe in. The courts in that park had cracked surfaces and nets that sagged in the middle. Calvin practiced there 6 days a week for 5 years. He didn't have a coach. He didn't have a team. He had a bucket of used balls his father bought at garage sales, and a wall behind the far court where the paint was peeling, and more hours alone than he could count. When Calvin was 19, Ernesto had a stroke. It wasn't fatal, but it changed everything. Calvin stopped playing and started working. That was the only math that made sense at the time. He told himself it was temporary. 12 years passed. He found out about the Westbrook Open Invitational the way most people find out about things they were never supposed to know about, by accident. He was fixing a toilet in the teacher's lounge at the school when one of the PE teachers came in, and they got to talking, and the teacher mentioned that his nephew had played in a tournament in Houston last spring, and that it was one of those rare open bracket events where anyone could register, not just academy players. Calvin asked the name of it. The teacher told him. Calvin finished fixing the toilet, drove home, and looked it up. The registration fee was $250. He sat with that number for 3 weeks. Then he registered. He didn't tell anyone, not his coworkers, not his mother, who still lived 2 streets over and would have worried. He just sent the registration and kept showing up to work and started waking up an hour earlier each morning to hit against the wall behind his apartment complex, which wasn't a tennis wall but was flat and solid and available. His racket was 11 years old. The grip had cracked. He wrapped it in electrical tape because electrical tape holds. He was not nervous when he pulled into the Westbrook facility. He wasn't performing calm. He actually felt it the same way he used to feel it when he was 16 and about to play someone twice his size on a cracked court with a sagging net. He had learned a long time ago that the court doesn't know where you come from. The ball doesn't know either. Raymond Holt noticed Calvin the moment he walked through the facility gate. It wasn't hard to notice. Everyone else arriving that morning came in groups, or had parents or coaches alongside them, or wore gear that signaled which academy had produced them. Calvin came alone, in a gray t-shirt that had been washed so many times it had softened into something close to linen, and those shoes that told their own story, and that racket with the tape. Holt was standing near the check-in table when Calvin came over to confirm his registration. He looked at the name on the list. He looked at Calvin. He looked at the racket. "You registered for the Open Division?" Holt asked. "Yes, sir," Calvin said. You're aware this is a competitive bracket. These are beginners. I know. Holt studied him for another moment, the way a man studies something he finds faintly ridiculous. Who coached you? My father. There was a pause. One of the junior players nearby, a 17-year-old named Brett, whose father sponsored the facility's new ball machine, snorted quietly. He didn't try to hide it. Holt said, "There are public clinics on Saturdays if that's more appropriate for your level." "I'm registered," Calvin said. "Not aggressive, not apologetic, just factual." Holt handed him a bracket sheet. "Court 6, he said, and turned away. Calvin's first match was against a 24-year-old from Austin who had played Division I college tennis at Texas A&M. His name was Sutton, and he was good. Quick feet, a flat first serve, a backhand he clearly trusted. He won the warm-up rally without effort and stood at the baseline looking at Calvin the way athletes look at opponents they've already dismissed. The match lasted 47 minutes. Calvin won 6-2, 6-1. He didn't play the way people expected from looking at him. He played with a patience that was almost unsettling, not waiting for mistakes exactly, but building points the way a person builds something with limited materials, carefully, without waste, always with the end in mind. His serve wasn't overwhelming. It was placed. His footwork wasn't flashy. It was efficient in a way that only comes from years of having no margin for error. Sutton shook his hand afterward and said, "Good match," in a tone that meant he was still processing what had happened. Calvin said, "Thank you," and walked off to find water. Word moves fast in a small facility. By the time Calvin's second match started, there were people standing along the fence of his court who hadn't been there before. Some of them were parents of junior players. Some of them were coaches from other academies who had come to scout. They stood with their arms crossed and watched. His second opponent was 32, a local club champion who drove a Range Rover and wore a GPS watch that tracked his heart rate during play. He was better than Sutton. He served hard, moved well, and had the kind of confidence that comes from winning local tournaments for a decade. Calvin beat him 6-3, 7-5. During the changeover at 5-5 in the second set, Raymond Holt appeared at the edge of the court. He stood there and watched the last two games without expression. When it ended, he didn't say anything. He just turned and walked back toward the main building. Brett, the kid with the sponsored father, was watching too. He was quiet now. The semifinal was different. Calvin's opponent was a man named Warren, who had played professionally on the Challenger circuit for 4 years before an elbow injury ended his career at 29. He now coached at a private club in Dallas. He was here competing because the open bracket was open, and because he still played, and because men like Warren never fully stopped competing. Warren was 41. He was still very good. He broke Calvin in the first game, held his serve, and built a 3-0 lead before Calvin had fully adjusted to the pace. The people along the fence shifted. A few of them nodded slightly, the way people do when they believe the natural order is reasserting itself. Calvin lost the first set 4-6. He sat during the set break and drank water and looked at the court. Not at Warren. Not at the people watching. At the court. He thought about a Tuesday morning when he was 15, when he had been on the park courts alone with his father, and his father had said something Calvin had never forgotten. They had been practicing serves, and Calvin kept missing, and he got frustrated, and Ernesto had walked over and said very quietly, "The frustration is telling you something. Listen to it. Don't fight it. It's not your enemy." Calvin had never been able to fully explain what that meant until he was on a court by himself, with no one watching, and finally understood that frustration is just information that hasn't been translated yet. He won the second set 6-3. The third set went to a tiebreak. At 6-6, Calvin hit 3 consecutive points that were so clean and so precisely placed that Warren, who had seen a great deal of tennis, stood on the other side of the net and stared at him for a moment before walking to the net to shake hands. Warren said, "Where have you been?" Calvin smiled. "Beaumont." Raymond Holt was waiting near the main building when Calvin walked off. Holt had a particular expression, the expression of a man who has built a professional identity around an ability to judge and who is currently in the process of revising that judgment, which is not comfortable for anyone. I owe you an apology, Holt said. Calvin looked at him. Okay. I made assumptions I shouldn't have made. Yes, you did. There was a pause, a longer one this time. Holt said, Who are you? Seriously, where did you play? Calvin told him, briefly, the park courts, his father, the wall behind the apartment complex, the 12 years of maintenance work and 4 a.m. drives and used balls from garage sales. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised Calvin. He said, My program has a scholarship fund for adult players returning to competition. It's never been used. I established it 6 years ago, and I have never once approved an application because I've never believed anyone who applied deserved it. He looked at Calvin. I want to put your name in front of the board. Calvin said, I didn't come here looking for charity. It's not charity, Holt said. It's a correction. The final was against a 28-year-old club pro named Derek Salinas, who had won the Westbrook Open twice before and knew the facility the way a person knows their own kitchen. He was organized, consistent, and difficult to rattle. His game had no great weaknesses and several reliable strengths. It was the best match Calvin had played in 12 years. They split the first 2 sets. The third went deep 6-6, then a tiebreak, then 8-8 in the tiebreak. Both men trading points with the focus of people who understood exactly what was at stake, not just the match, but something harder to name. At 9-8, Calvin was serving. He bounced the ball once, twice. He looked at the far court, not at Derek, not at the crowd that had gathered. And there was a crowd now, people who had drifted over from other courts because someone said something was happening on court 3. He served. The ball landed in the corner of the service box with a precision that the best servers practice for years to achieve. Derek moved, read it late, stretched, and pushed a return that floated high and short. Calvin stepped in and put it away. The sound was small, just a ball hitting a court surface, but the silence that followed it was very loud. He was sitting in his truck in the parking lot an hour later, the window down, the Houston heat coming in slow and heavy, when his phone rang. It was his mother. How did it go? She said. I won, he said. There was a pause on her end, a long one. He could hear the television in the background, the one she kept on too loud because the house felt too quiet otherwise. Calvin, she said. Yeah. Your father would have. She didn't finish. I know, he said. He sat there for another few minutes after he hung up, watching the other cars leave. He thought about the park courts with the cracked surfaces and the sagging nets. He thought about a bucket of used balls and a wall and a Tuesday morning and what his father had said about frustration. He thought about the $250 registration fee that he had paid from money he saved over 3 months, and about the fact that by the time he drove home, Westbrook Elite Tennis Academy had announced on its website that its returning adult scholarship program, the one that had existed for 6 years and never once been awarded, would begin accepting applications immediately, with fees waived for the first cohort. Nobody had asked them to do it. Nobody had staged a protest or written a letter. One man had shown up to a court with a cracked racket and electrical tape and played tennis the way he had been playing it since he was 14 years old. And something in the room had shifted. That's what happens sometimes. Not always, not often enough, but sometimes one person refuses to accept that they don't belong in a room, and the room ends up being the thing that changes. Raymond Holt never talked publicly about what he said to Calvin Reyes on the day of registration. He didn't have to. 3 people standing nearby had heard it, and in the way of small communities, it was known. What he did do was call Calvin the following week and ask if he would be willing to come to the academy on a Thursday morning to hit with some of the junior players. Not to coach, not formally, just to play. Calvin said he'd think about it. He went. He stood on a proper court with a proper net and a bucket of new balls, and a 16-year-old girl named Esperanza, who was the facility's most promising junior player and who had been told her entire life that she had exceptional talent. Watched him warm up and then said to the coach standing beside her, quietly, "Who is that?" The coach said, "His name is Calvin Reyes." He works maintenance in Beaumont. Esperanza watched him move across the court, reading the angle of the ball before it arrived, adjusting without hurry, hitting with the kind of ease that only looks effortless to people who don't know how much work is hiding inside it. She said, "He doesn't play like someone who works maintenance." The coach said, "No, he doesn't." There's a locked drawer in Calvin's apartment. It's the bottom drawer of an old dresser his father had in the house where Calvin grew up. When Ernesto had his stroke and Calvin moved home to help, he took the dresser with him when he eventually got his own place, and the drawer came with it, locked, and Calvin had never found the key. He'd meant to open it for years. He had a habit of buying cheap padlocks of the same brand, hoping one of the keys would fit, and none ever did. A month after the Westbrook tournament, his mother was cleaning out the garage and found a small envelope in a box she'd been meaning to go through since Ernesto died 3 years ago. Inside the envelope were two things, a photograph and a key. The photograph was of Ernesto at about 25, standing on a tennis court Calvin didn't recognize, holding a racket and smiling the way people smile when someone they like is behind the camera. He looked relaxed. He looked happy. He looked like a person who belonged exactly where he was. The key opened the drawer. Inside there was a composition notebook. On the cover, in Ernesto's handwriting, for Calvin, "Everything I Know." It ran to 87 pages. Stroke technique, court positioning, mental approach, notes on specific players Ernesto had watched or read about, diagrams drawn in blue pen, and at the very end, a single page with no diagrams, just words. The court doesn't care what you're wearing. The ball doesn't know where you went to school. The only thing the game asks is whether you showed up and whether you were honest with yourself about what you needed to learn. Everything else is noise. Don't let the noise win. Calvin read it sitting on the floor of his apartment with his back against the dresser, the notebook in his lap, the drawer hanging open beside him. He read it twice. Then he sat there for a while in the quiet and thought about his father teaching him on cracked courts with used balls and a sagging net, and about how that had been enough. How it had always been enough. And about how many other people are out there right now on their own cracked courts, with their own buckets of used balls, being taught by someone who believes in them even when the rest of the world isn't paying attention. The question is whether the rest of the world ever figures out what it's missing. I keep thinking about that taped-up racket. Not because it was sad, because of what it meant that Calvin Reyes showed up with it anyway. He didn't show up with it because he had no other choice. He showed up with it because he had made a decision a long time ago about what actually mattered and what didn't. The tape wasn't a symbol of poverty. It was a symbol of someone who had already done the math and decided the court was worth more than the appearance of belonging to it. That's the thing about character. Real character, the kind that doesn't need an audience. It shows up in the small decisions. The decision to wake up earlier than necessary. The decision to drive 4 hours before sunrise. The decision to walk through a gate where nobody expects you and hand over a registration form that you saved 3 months to pay for. Those decisions don't feel dramatic when you make them. They just feel like the next right thing to do. But they accumulate, and what they accumulate into is a person that no amount of dismissal can actually diminish. Raymond Holt looked at Calvin and saw the wrong things. He saw the tape on the grip. He saw the shoes. He saw the absence of an Academy logo on the shirt. What he missed, what people like him almost always miss, is that discipline lived quietly and a body looks exactly like ordinariness from the outside. Calvin had spent years developing something that doesn't advertise itself. The ability to read a court before the ball arrives. The patience to build a point when other people would force one. The mental steadiness that Ernesto had handed down, not in a training manual, but in a Tuesday morning conversation about frustration being information rather than failure. That kind of intelligence doesn't come from expensive coaching. It comes from paying close attention for a very long time, with no guarantee that anyone will ever notice. And here's what I've come to believe about the way things play out. When a person combines that kind of integrity, showing up honestly, competing without excuse, refusing to be reduced by someone else's ceiling, with that kind of quiet intelligence, and then adds to it the sheer stubbornness of continuing for 12 years with no recognition and no reward, something eventually gives, not because the universe is keeping score, but because excellence applied consistently in a specific direction will eventually make contact with an opportunity, and when it does, the result tends to be undeniable. Calvin didn't win that tournament because he got lucky. He won it because he had been preparing for it for more than a decade in a park against a wall, with used balls, watched only by a man who believed in him completely. The locked drawer, the composition notebook, 87 pages of everything Ernesto knew. That detail stays with me more than anything else in this story. Because Ernesto wrote it down. He wrote it all down and locked it away for his son to find, not as a shortcut, but as a confirmation, as if he knew Calvin would eventually make it to a court that was worth the knowledge. And he wanted to make sure his son understood that the foundation had always been solid. The question the story leaves me with isn't about Calvin. Calvin figured it out. The question is about everyone who watched him lose the first set of that semifinal and nodded to themselves like the outcome was already settled. And about how many people like Calvin are still out there right now, playing on cracked courts, being taught by someone who believes in them, waiting for a room to notice what has been missing.